Sarah Martinez adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock on her computer screen. Another stack of incident reports sat on her desk, waiting to be processed and filed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile office building, casting everything in that familiar government-issued pale glow. To anyone walking past her cubicle, she looked like every other middle-aged administrative worker in the Department of Defense building. Her fingers moved efficiently across the keyboard, typing up summaries of training exercises and equipment requisitions. The work was routine, predictable, and exactly what people expected from someone in her position. Sarah had been doing this job for 3 years now, ever since she'd requested a transfer to what everyone called the paper-pushing department. "Hey, Sarah, you got a minute?" called Tom Rodriguez from the next cubicle over. He was waving a stack of forms that needed her signature. "Sure thing," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of shouting orders over helicopter rotors and gunfire. Most people assumed it was just from too many cigarettes, though Sarah had never smoked a day in her life. Tom handed over the paperwork with a grateful smile. "Thanks. I swear these requisition forms get more complicated every month. How do you keep track of all this stuff?" Sarah scanned the documents quickly, her eyes moving with a precision that spoke of someone trained to spot details others might miss. "Practice, I guess. Been dealing with military paperwork for longer than I care to remember." "Well, you're a lifesaver. My wife keeps asking when I'm going to get promoted out of this place, but honestly, I don't know how anyone manages without you handling the complicated stuff." After Tom returned to his desk, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. If only he knew that the complicated stuff she'd handled in her previous career made these forms look like children's puzzles. She'd once coordinated supply drops behind enemy lines while under mortar fire, managing to keep 3 different special operations teams supplied and operational for 2 weeks straight. But that was another life. Now she was content to let people see exactly what they expected to see. The morning passed quietly, broken only by the occasional phone call from various departments needing clarification on reports or requesting specific documents from the archives. Sarah handled each inquiry with professional efficiency, her voice pleasant but unremarkable. Around lunchtime, a young lieutenant named Jessica Chen stopped by her desk. The woman looked nervous, clutching a tablet and glancing around as if she wasn't sure she was in the right place. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez? The one who handles the classified incident reports?" "That's me. What can I help you with, Lieutenant?" Jessica leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I'm working on a research project about counterterrorism operations from the early 2000s. My supervisor said you might be able to help me locate some specific files. They're pretty old, and apparently the filing system back then was different." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. "What kind of operations are you researching?" "Small unit tactics in urban environments, specifically missions that involved civilian rescue operations. I'm looking for anything from Iraq or Afghanistan between 2003 and 2008. The files would have been classified at the time, but most of them have been declassified for academic research now." "That's a pretty specific time frame," Sarah noted, her fingers drumming silently on her desk. "What's the focus of your research?" "I'm trying to understand how female operators were integrated into special operations during that period. There's not a lot of documentation about it, but I know women were involved in some high-risk missions. My thesis advisor thinks it's important to document their contributions." For a moment, Sarah was quiet. She stared at her computer screen. But her mind was elsewhere, remembering dusty streets in Fallujah, the weight of body armor in 120-degree heat, and the faces of civilians who'd looked at her with hope when she'd appeared in doorways they'd thought would be their tombs. "I can help you find those files," she said finally, "but it might take some time. That era had some unusual classification protocols." Jessica's face brightened. "Really? That would be amazing. My advisor said most people wouldn't know where to even start looking." "Your advisor was right. Those operations required special clearance levels that most people never had access to. But I know my way around the old filing systems. After Jessica left with a promise to return later in the week, Sarah sat back in her chair and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She'd been careful to build a reputation as someone who was simply good at navigating bureaucracy, nothing more. But the truth was, she didn't need to look up those files. She remembered most of those missions in vivid detail because she'd been there. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. A man in his 50s wearing a crisp suit approached her desk, his bearing and haircut screaming military despite his civilian clothes. His eyes swept the office with the automatic assessment of someone trained in threat evaluation. "Ms. Martinez, I'm David Walsh, from the Inspector General's office. I was hoping to speak with you about some discrepancies in a few incident reports from last month." Sarah's posture didn't change, but her senses sharpened. "Of course. Which reports are you referring to?" 3 separate training incidents at Fort Bragg, all involving the same unit. The initial reports seemed incomplete. When I spoke to the commanding officer, he suggested you might have additional insights since you processed the paperwork. "I process a lot of reports, Mr. Walsh. Can you be more specific about what kind of discrepancies you're seeing?" Walsh pulled out a tablet and showed her several documents. Sarah scanned them quickly, her trained eye immediately spotting the problems. The reports had been sanitized, with key details removed or altered. Someone was trying to cover up what had really happened during those training exercises. "These look like standard incident reports to me," she said carefully. "Is there something specific that concerns you? The injuries reported don't match the medical records, and the timeline doesn't add up. 3 soldiers were hospitalized, but according to these reports, it was just a routine training accident." Sarah studied Walsh more carefully. His questions were too precise, too focused. This wasn't a random audit. Someone had specifically sent him to dig into these particular incidents, which meant someone suspected the truth was being hidden. "I can pull the original files if you'd like," she offered. "Sometimes details get lost when reports go through multiple levels of review." "That would be very helpful. I have reason to believe these soldiers were involved in something more complex than standard training." After Walsh left, Sarah made a mental note to look into what had really happened at Fort Bragg. If someone was asking questions about classified operations being disguised as training accidents, it meant either security protocols were breaking down or someone was getting sloppy with their cover stories. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the people moving through the office. She'd developed an instinct for spotting when patterns were changing, when the normal rhythm of an environment was being disrupted. Today felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly why. As 5 o'clock approached, her colleagues began shutting down their computers and gathering their belongings. Sarah typically stayed later, using the quiet time after hours to handle the more sensitive documents that required extra attention. But today, she decided to leave with everyone else. "Heading out early today?" asked Tom, looking surprised to see her packing up. "Thought I'd try something different for once," Sarah replied with a smile. "Maybe stop by the gym before dinner." It was a lie, of course. Sarah had no intention of going to any civilian gym. But she'd noticed a pattern in the day's visitors and conversations that suggested it might be wise to vary her routine. When you'd spent years in situations where the wrong choice could get people killed, you learned to trust your instincts even when you couldn't fully explain them. As she walked to her car, Sarah mentally reviewed the day. A research request about female special operators, questions about suspicious incident reports, and the general feeling that more people were paying attention to her than usual. It could all be coincidence, but Sarah had learned long ago that coincidences were usually anything but. She drove home to her modest apartment, taking a route that allowed her to check for surveillance without being obvious about it. Old habits died hard, and some habits were too important to let die at all. That evening, as she sat in her living room with a cup of tea, Sarah allowed herself to think about the path that had brought her to this desk job. Most of her colleagues saw her as a competent but unremarkable administrative worker who happened to be good with paperwork. They had no idea that she'd once led rescue missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, or that she'd received commendations from generals whose names were classified. She'd chosen this quiet life deliberately, seeking the normalcy and anonymity that had been impossible during her operational years. But lately, Sarah was beginning to wonder if her past was starting to catch up with her present. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah arrived at the office to find a message waiting on her voicemail from someone claiming to be from the Pentagon's Historical Review Board. They were requesting access to personnel files from special operations units active between 2003 and 2009, specifically looking for documentation about non-standard operator assignments. Sarah played the message twice, noting the caller's precise diction and the background sounds that suggested they were calling from a secure facility rather than a regular office. This wasn't a routine academic inquiry. Someone was specifically hunting for information about operators who'd been involved in classified missions during that time frame. She'd barely finished listening to the voicemail when Jessica Chen appeared at her desk again, this time accompanied by a man in his 30s wearing the uniform of an Army major. "Ms. Martinez, this is Major Kevin Park. He's helping with my research project, and he has some additional questions about the files we discussed yesterday." Sarah studied the major carefully. His uniform was correct down to the smallest detail, but something about his manner suggested he was more than just a research assistant. His eyes had the constant alertness she recognized in people who'd seen combat, and his stance was that of someone ready to react to threats. "Major Park, what specific information are you looking for?" Sarah asked, her tone professional but cautious. "We're particularly interested in any documentation about task force operations that involve civilian rescue missions in urban environments. The lieutenant mentioned you might have access to files that aren't in the standard databases." "That's a very specific request. May I ask why you're focusing on those particular operations?" Major Park exchanged a glance with Jessica before answering. "We have reason to believe that several successful missions from that era weren't properly documented in the historical record. Operations that saved civilian lives and demonstrated innovative tactical approaches. It's important that those contributions aren't forgotten." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The major's phrasing was too careful, too precise. He wasn't just researching history. He was looking for something specific, and his questions were getting uncomfortably close to operations she'd been personally involved in. "I'll see what I can find," she said finally. "But those kinds of files often have complex access requirements. It might take some time." After they left, Sarah sat quietly at her desk, her mind racing through possibilities. 2 different inquiries about special operations from the same time period, both focusing on the kind of missions she'd been involved in. Either it was an extraordinary coincidence, or someone was specifically looking for information about her former unit. She spent the rest of the morning going through her routine tasks, but part of her attention was focused on monitoring the office environment. Who was coming and going, which conversations seemed normal, and which felt like they had hidden agendas. Around noon, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 5 years. "Sarah, it's Marcus Thompson. We need to talk." Marcus had been her team leader during some of the most dangerous missions of her career. The fact that he was calling her at work using her real name meant something was seriously wrong. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spike. "Sarah Elena Martinez, serial number 243678934, currently working as an administrative specialist at DoD Building 7. We definitely need to talk." The use of her full name and service number sent a clear message. This wasn't a social call, and Marcus wasn't taking no for an answer. "I get off work at 5, Sarah said quietly. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks north of your building. Be there at 5:15. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone and wondering if her carefully constructed quiet life was about to come crashing down around her. Sarah spent the afternoon trying to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the phone call from Marcus. She hadn't spoken to anyone from her old unit in 5 years, not since she'd officially transitioned out of special operations and into her current administrative role. The fact that he'd tracked her down at work suggested something urgent was happening. At precisely 5 o'clock, Sarah gathered her things and headed for the coffee shop Marcus had mentioned. The small cafe was busy with the after-work crowd, providing good cover for a conversation that needed to stay private. She spotted Marcus immediately, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall and a clear view of all the entrances. He looked older than she remembered, with more gray in his hair and new lines around his eyes. But he still carried himself with the controlled alertness of someone who'd spent years in situations where relaxing your guard could get you killed. "Sarah," he said as she approached, standing to embrace her briefly. To anyone watching, they looked like old friends meeting for coffee. "Marcus, you look good," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Though I have to admit I'm surprised to hear from you." "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. We have a problem, and unfortunately, you're right in the middle of it." Sarah sipped her coffee and waited for him to explain. Marcus had always been direct, never wasting time with small talk when serious matters were at stake. "Someone's been asking questions about Operation Nightingale," Marcus continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Specifically about the civilian rescue phase and who was involved in the on-ground coordination." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Operation Nightingale had been one of the most classified missions of her career, involving the rescue of kidnapped diplomats from a terrorist compound in Iraq. The operation had been successful, but it had also been officially erased from all records after political complications arose. "That operation doesn't exist," Sarah said automatically. "Exactly. But someone knows it did, and they're trying to piece together what really happened. More importantly, they're specifically asking about the female operator who coordinated the civilian extractions." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Only a handful of people had known about her role in that mission, and most of them were either dead or so deep in the intelligence community that they'd never talk. "Who's asking the questions?" "That's what worries me. The inquiries are coming through official channels, but they're being routed in ways that suggest someone with serious clearance is driving them. Someone who knows enough to ask the right questions, but not enough to know why those questions are dangerous." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photograph. It was Major Park, the man who'd been asking about task force operations just that morning. "Kevin Park, Army Intelligence. He's been nosing around Fort Bragg, asking about training incidents that were actually cover stories for classified debriefs. Yesterday, he requested access to personnel files from your old unit. He was in my office this morning with a graduate student asking about documentation for special operations involving civilian rescues." Marcus cursed under his breath. "This is worse than I thought. If he's already made the connection to you, then someone's feeding him information. Or he's very good at his job," Sarah pointed out. "There are ways to track operational patterns even when the specific details are classified." "Maybe. But Sarah, there's something else. 3 days ago, someone broke into the storage facility where we keep the archived equipment from Nightingale. They didn't take anything, but they photographed everything, including your gear." Sarah set down her coffee cup with extra care, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Her equipment from that mission would have been distinctive, modified for her specific role and body type. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would be able to identify not just that a female operator had been involved, but potentially who that operator was. "How bad is this?" she asked. Bad enough that I've been pulled out of retirement to help contain it. The brass is worried that if details about Nightingale become public, it could compromise ongoing operations and expose assets who are still in the field. And they want me to disappear again. Marcus shook his head. Actually, that's the problem. Disappearing now would only confirm that there's something to hide. Instead, they want you to stay exactly where you are and help us figure out who's driving these inquiries and why. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. She'd chosen her current job specifically because it was safe, predictable, and far removed from the world of special operations. The idea of being pulled back into that life, even temporarily, filled her with a mixture of dread and something that might have been excitement. What exactly are you asking me to do? Keep doing your job, but pay attention to who's asking what questions. Report back on anyone who seems too interested in that time period. And most importantly, don't let them know you were involved in any of it. Marcus, these people aren't stupid. If Major Park is as good as you say he is, he's going to figure out the connection eventually. Maybe. But if we can identify who's really behind this before that happens, we might be able to shut it down quietly. They spent the next hour discussing operational security and communication protocols. Sarah would continue her normal routine, but she'd have a way to contact Marcus immediately if the situation escalated. To anyone watching, they were just old friends catching up over coffee. As they prepared to leave, Marcus grabbed her arm gently. "Sarah, I know you didn't want this life anymore. If there was any other way—" "I know," she said. "You wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Just promise me you'll keep me informed about what's really going on." The next morning, Sarah arrived at work to find her computer had been accessed overnight. Someone with administrative privileges had gone through her recent file requests and email correspondence. It was done professionally, with minimal traces, but Sarah's training had taught her to look for exactly this kind of intrusion. She spent the morning going through her normal routine while carefully documenting everything that seemed unusual. At lunch, she used a secure phone to call Marcus and report the security breach. "They're getting impatient," Marcus said, "or more nervous. Either way, this is escalating faster than we expected." That afternoon brought a new visitor. A woman in her 50s, wearing the insignia of a Navy commander, approached Sarah's desk with a confident stride that suggested someone accustomed to having her orders followed. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Commander Patricia Hayes, Naval Intelligence. I understand you've been assisting with research into historical special operations." Sarah looked up from her computer, her expression politely curious. "I help researchers locate files when they need them. Is there something specific you're looking for?" "I'm interested in cross-service cooperation during counterterrorism operations, specifically missions that involved Joint Army-Navy personnel. I believe you may have access to documentation that hasn't been digitized yet." "That's possible. What time frame are you researching?" 2003 to 2008, primarily operations in Iraq. I'm particularly interested in missions that involve non-standard personnel assignments." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Commander Hayes was using almost exactly the same language as Major Park, but with enough variation to suggest they weren't directly coordinating. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or multiple people were independently investigating the same operations. "I can look into that for you," Sarah said. "But records from that period can be complex to locate. The filing systems weren't standardized across services. I understand you have particular expertise with classified documentation from that era. My colleagues speak very highly of your abilities." The comment was phrased as a compliment, but Sarah heard the underlying question. Commander Hayes was fishing for information about Sarah's background, trying to determine if she had personal knowledge of the operations rather than just administrative access to the files. "I've been working with military paperwork for a long time," Sarah replied carefully. "You learn to navigate the bureaucracy." After Commander Hayes left, Sarah made another call to Marcus. The fact that naval intelligence was now involved suggested the scope of the investigation was expanding beyond what they'd initially assumed. "This isn't just about Nightingale anymore," Marcus said grimly. "Someone's conducting a comprehensive review of joint operations from your active period. They're looking for patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "The kind that might reveal how special operations were really conducted during that time frame. Sarah, if they're thorough enough, they're going to uncover operations that were never supposed to see daylight." That evening, Sarah decided to do something she hadn't done in months. She drove to a gym across town that catered to military personnel and law enforcement. She needed to think, and physical exercise had always helped her process complex problems. The gym was busy with people she recognized as military, though none of them seemed to know her. She settled into a routine of weights and cardio, letting her mind work through the day's developments while her body went through familiar motions. She was on the treadmill when she noticed him, a man in his 30s, wearing civilian clothes but with the unmistakable posture and haircut of military personnel. He was pretending to work out, but his attention kept drifting to her. After 20 minutes, she was certain he was conducting surveillance. Sarah finished her workout and headed for the locker room, taking a route that would allow her to get a better look at the man. As she passed him, she caught sight of his reflection in a mirror and felt her stomach drop. She recognized his face from classified briefings 5 years ago. He was with a unit that handled extremely sensitive operations, the kind of people who were called in when situations needed to disappear completely. She changed clothes quickly and left through a back exit, taking a circuitous route home while checking for additional surveillance. The presence of someone from that particular unit suggested the situation was far more serious than Marcus had indicated. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat in the dark and considered her options. She could pack a bag and disappear, using skills and contacts that would make her nearly impossible to find. But running would confirm that she had something to hide, and it would leave Marcus and potentially others exposed. Or she could stay and play out whatever game was developing around her, trusting that her years of training and experience would be enough to navigate whatever was coming. The decision was made for her when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know who you are, Sarah Elena Martinez. We know what you did in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in places that don't appear on any map. Tomorrow, you're going to help us, or a lot of people are going to learn about operations that were supposed to stay buried forever." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Someone had just declared war on her carefully constructed new life, and they'd made it clear that surrender wasn't an option. She spent the rest of the evening making preparations she hoped she wouldn't need. Weapons cleaned and loaded, emergency supplies gathered, escape routes planned. But even as she prepared for the worst, part of her mind was focused on a different problem. Whoever was behind this investigation knew too much to be working from the outside. Someone with access to classified information was feeding them details about operations that should have been completely buried, which meant that somewhere in the intelligence community, there was a leak. And tomorrow, Sarah was going to have to figure out who it was while pretending to be nothing more than an administrative worker who happened to be good with paperwork. As she finally tried to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the young soldiers she'd helped rescue during Operation Nightingale. They'd looked at her with gratitude and relief when she'd appeared in that basement, their faces dirty but alive. She'd promised them they were safe, that she would get them home. Tomorrow, she might have to break her cover to keep that promise. And if she did, the quiet life she'd built for herself would be over forever. But some promises were worth any sacrifice, and Sarah had never walked away from people who needed her protection. The war might be coming to her, but she'd fought wars before. This time, however, the battlefield would be her own life, and the enemy might be people she'd once trusted with her life. She closed her eyes and tried to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test every skill she'd learned in 20 years of special operations. The woman who'd once been one of the military's most effective operators was about to discover if 3 years behind a desk had dulled her edge, or if some abilities never faded no matter how long you tried to forget them. Sarah arrived at work the next morning with a heightened sense of awareness that came from years of operating in hostile territory. Every person who passed her desk was evaluated for potential threats. Every conversation monitored for hidden meanings. She'd activated mental protocols she hadn't used in 3 years, shifting from the mindset of an administrative worker to that of an operator in enemy territory. The morning started normally enough, with routine paperwork and the usual stream of minor requests. But at 10:30, everything changed. Major Park arrived at her desk, this time in full dress uniform, and accompanied by 2 other officers Sarah didn't recognize. "Ms. Martinez, I need to speak with you privately. This is Colonel James Morrison from the Pentagon and Captain Lisa Chang from Naval Special Warfare Command." Sarah looked up from her computer, her expression calm despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. The presence of officers from different branches, all in dress uniform, suggested this was no longer a research project. "Of course. Would you like to use one of the conference rooms?" "That won't be necessary," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Martinez, we need you to come with us. There's a situation that requires your immediate attention." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She evaluated her options, assessed the threat level, and calculated her chances of leaving the building independently. But something in Captain Chang's expression made her pause. The woman was looking at her with what appeared to be respect rather than suspicion. "May I ask what kind of situation?" "The kind that requires the expertise of someone with your particular background," Colonel Morrison replied. "We can discuss the details once we're in a secure environment." Sarah glanced around the office. Noting that several of her colleagues were watching with curiosity, whatever was happening, it was already drawing attention. She made a decision that would either prove to be brilliant or catastrophic. "Let me grab my purse," she said, standing slowly and reaching for her bag. Inside, her fingers found the emergency beacon Marcus had given her, and she activated it with a subtle press. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a secure briefing room in the Pentagon, facing a group of officers whose presence suggested she was no longer dealing with a simple investigation into historical operations. The room's occupants included representatives from Army Special Operations Command, Naval Special Warfare, and what appeared to be personnel from agencies so classified their affiliations weren't displayed. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Morrison began, "let's dispense with the pretense. We know who you are, and we know what you've done. The question now is whether you're willing to do it again." Sarah remained silent, her face impassive. Years of interrogation resistance training had taught her the value of letting others reveal their hand first. Captain Chang leaned forward. 12 hours ago, a terrorist cell took hostages at the American consulate in Kandahar. Among the hostages are 3 State Department officials and a CIA station chief. The terrorists are demanding the release of prisoners from Guantanamo Bay in exchange for the hostages' lives. "That's unfortunate," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Major Park spoke up. "Because the building layout and the hostage situation are almost identical to Operation Nightingale. Same terrorist organization, same tactics, same type of compound. The only difference is that this time, we know about it in advance." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her expression didn't change. "I'm afraid I don't know what Operation Nightingale is." Colonel Morrison smiled grimly. "Sarah Elena Martinez, former Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment, later attached to Joint Special Operations Command. Participated in 47 classified missions between 2003 and 2008, including Operation Nightingale. where you single-handedly coordinated the rescue of 6 hostages from a terrorist compound in Fallujah. You received 2 silver stars, a bronze star with valor, and a Presidential Unit Citation, Captain Chang added. Your psychological profile indicates exceptional performance under extreme stress and an ability to make critical decisions in life-or-death situations. Sarah stared at them for a long moment. Her cover was blown, her quiet life was over, and she was being asked to return to a world she'd deliberately left behind. But there were hostages who needed help, and she'd never been able to turn her back on people in danger. What exactly are you asking me to do? We need you to go in first, Major Park explained, pulling up building schematics on a large display screen. The compound has the same basic layout as the Fallujah operation, but with modern security upgrades. Our intelligence suggests the terrorists have learned from previous rescue attempts and modified their defensive positions accordingly. You want me to conduct a solo reconnaissance mission to update intelligence before the main assault team goes in, Sarah said, reading between the lines. Precisely. You have the experience, the skills, and most importantly, the psychological profile needed for this type of operation. The hostages have maybe 18 hours before the terrorists start executing them. Sarah studied the building schematics, her tactical mind automatically analyzing approach routes, defensive positions, and potential extraction points. Despite 3 years behind a desk, she could still read a battlefield like other people read books. Who's running the assault team? That would be us, said a voice from the back of the room. Sarah turned to see Marcus Thompson entering, followed by 4 other men she recognized immediately. They were her former teammates from the most classified operations of her career, the ones who'd been with her during missions that officially never happened. Marcus, I should have known you were involved in setting this up. Actually, Sarah, I wasn't. When the hostage situation developed, these gentlemen contacted me about reassembling the team for a rescue operation. When I told them you'd retired from operational duty, they explained they'd already been investigating your background for other reasons. Colonel Morrison stepped forward. Ms. Martinez, we need to be completely honest with you. The investigation into your past wasn't random. For the past 6 months, we've been dealing with a series of security breaches involving classified operations from your era. Someone with intimate knowledge of those missions has been selling information to hostile intelligence services. We've been working backwards through compromised operations trying to identify the leak, Captain Chang continued. Your name came up because you were involved in several missions that were later compromised. We needed to determine if you were the source. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. You thought I was the traitor. We had to consider the possibility, Major Park admitted, but our investigation cleared you completely. In fact, it revealed that someone has been specifically targeting operations you were involved in, probably because they were some of the most successful missions of that era. Which brings us to the current situation, Colonel Morrison said. The terrorist group holding the hostages has information about American operations that should be impossible for them to know. We believe they're being fed intelligence by our leak. This rescue mission isn't just about saving hostages, it's about stopping a traitor who's been selling out American operatives for months. Sarah looked at Marcus and her former teammates. These were men she'd trusted with her life, who'd followed her into situations where the odds of survival had been questionable at best. If they were asking for her help, the situation was serious enough to pull her back into a world she'd tried to leave behind. If I agree to this, what guarantees do I have about my future? My current life? None, Colonel Morrison said bluntly. If you participate in this mission, your cover as an administrative worker is permanently blown. But Sarah, if we don't stop this leak, more operations will be compromised and more lives will be lost. We need someone with your specific skills and experience. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about the young soldiers she'd rescued during Operation Nightingale, about the hostages currently facing execution, about the unknown number of operatives whose lives were at risk because of a traitor. When she opened her eyes, her expression had changed. The mild-mannered administrative worker was gone, replaced by someone whose presence commanded immediate attention. "I'll need complete operational authority for the reconnaissance phase," she said, her voice carrying a tone of command that made several officers in the room sit up straighter. "I choose my equipment, my approach route, and my extraction method. No interference from command until I signal the all-clear for the main assault." "Done," Colonel Morrison said immediately. "I'll also need my team for backup and support. These 4 men know my operational patterns better than anyone." "They're already briefed and equipped," Marcus said with a slight smile. "And when this is over, I want full disclosure about the investigation into the security leaks. If someone's been targeting my former operations, I have a right to know who and why." "Agreed." Sarah stood up, and as she did, her entire demeanor shifted. The transformation was so complete that several people in the room took an involuntary step back. This was no longer a woman who filed reports and processed paperwork. This was an operator who'd survived some of the most dangerous missions in modern military history. "Then let's go save some hostages and catch a traitor." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah was fitted with equipment she hadn't worn in 3 years, weapons she hadn't fired in even longer. But as she ran through weapons checks and equipment inspections, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with the efficient precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. As the sun set, Sarah found herself on a military transport heading toward Afghanistan, surrounded by her former teammates and facing a mission that would either save lives or get them all killed. The administrative worker who'd processed incident reports that morning was gone, replaced by one of the most effective special operations soldiers of her generation. 8 hours later, Sarah lay in the dust outside the terrorist compound in Kandahar, conducting the reconnaissance that would determine whether the rescue mission succeeded or failed. Through her scope, she watched the hostages, counted the guards, and mapped their patrol patterns with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among her peers. When she finally signaled the all-clear for the main assault, everything happened with clockwork precision. Marcus and the team moved through the compound like ghosts, neutralizing threats and securing hostages with the efficiency that came from years of training and absolute trust in each other. The mission was a complete success. All hostages were rescued, the terrorist cell was eliminated, and critically important intelligence was recovered that would help identify the leak in American security systems. But it was what happened after the mission that would become the moment Sarah would never forget. As the hostages were being evacuated and the compound was secured, a team of soldiers approached the area where Sarah was conducting post-mission equipment checks. These weren't regular Army personnel or even standard special operations troops. Their gear, their bearing, and their weapons identified them as members of the most elite special operations unit in the American military, the kind of operators whose very existence was classified. The team leader, a man whose face was partially concealed by tactical gear, approached Sarah directly. Without saying a word, he came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. One by one, the other members of his team did the same. "Ma'am," the team leader said, his voice carrying deep respect, "it's an honor to serve on the same battlefield as you." Marcus, who was standing nearby, smiled with pride. "Gentlemen, meet the woman who wrote the book on hostage rescue in urban environments. Every tactical manual you've studied, every protocol you've trained on, came from missions she planned and executed." The team leader nodded slowly. "We know, sir. Every operator in our community knows her call sign and her record. We've been following her career since before most of us enlisted." Sarah looked at the faces around her, some hidden by tactical gear, but all showing the same expression of professional respect. These were the most elite soldiers in the world, operators whose own accomplishments were legendary within the special operations community, and they were saluting her. "Ma'am," the team leader continued, "there are stories told in training about the ghost who could appear anywhere, complete impossible missions, and disappear without a trace. We always wondered if those stories were true. They're true, Marcus said quietly, and you just watched her prove it again. As the special operations team moved away to their own mission, Sarah realized that her quiet life was indeed over. But looking at the rescued hostages, seeing the respect in the eyes of elite soldiers, remembering the weight of responsibility and purpose that came with this work, she found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. The administrative worker who filed reports had been a comfortable disguise, but the woman who saved lives and completed impossible missions, that was who she really was. And sometimes the world needed heroes more than it needed clerks. 3 months later, Sarah found herself in a new position within the Department of Defense, officially serving as a consultant on counterterrorism operations and hostage rescue protocols. Unofficially, she was back to doing what she'd always done best, going places other people couldn't go, doing things other people couldn't do, and bringing home people who needed saving. Her colleagues in the administrative office sometimes asked what had happened to the quiet woman who used to process their paperwork. But Sarah just smiled and told them she'd found a position that better suited her skills. She never mentioned the medals locked in a safe deposit box, or the missions that would never appear in any official record, or the moment when some of the world's most elite soldiers had rendered their respect with a perfect salute. Some stories, after all, were worth more when they remained legends whispered in training facilities and remembered in the halls where heroes walked quietly among ordinary people, waiting for the moment when the world would need them again.